Welcome to another podcast of Safepedia. We've got a great discussion lined up for you today and some amazing guests. We're going to be looking at the practice of EHSQ and what's influencing it these days. We've gone through a lot in the past few years: the pandemic, worker shortage, churn, an increased emphasis on ESG, as well as supply chain issues, mental health, as well as trying to figure out what is our work-life balance of our workers these days. We've noticed that, especially in our own peer group, health and safety professionals, there's an increasing responsibility happening for ESG, and that we need to go beyond doing our traditional health and safety role. We're in for a treat because this is going to be a two-part series of an interview. And we have our sponsor, Intelex Technologies, ULC, who is supporting us in this. Now, for those of you who don't know, Intelex Technology is a leader in global environmental health and safety and quality management software. They offer a complete set of applications for EHSQ, as well as for environmental, social, and governance. The company is headquartered in Toronto, Canada, with regional offices and employees located around the world. Now, joining us today are two special friends of my own that I used to work with, and it's a privilege to have you back on the show. This is not your first rodeo. We have Michael Tuohy, who's the Vice President of Environmental and Sustainability at Intelex Technologies, and Trevor Bronson, who's the Strategic Development Manager at Intelex Technologies. Welcome, guys.
Thanks for having us, Tamara.
Yeah, thanks, Tamara.
So we're going to be diving in to talk about EHS and EGS, that's a tongue twister, and what are the trends that you guys are seeing shaping up, right? But before we get into that, maybe you could share a little bit about how you guys got into this area, ESG. Trevor, why don't you go first?
Yeah, sure thing. So my journey in this industry has been an interesting one, to say the least. I am educated in this, so I majored in environment, health, safety, and sustainability at college. From there, I went to an analyst firm, Verdantix, where I spent about 4 years researching the technology space, the space from the angle of the practitioners that can get value out of technology. I really was able to look at the industry from almost all sides and make sure that whatever side you were on, you were finding the value that you needed and excelling at your endeavors in EHS and ESG. I'll touch on more of that in a second, no matter if you were a vendor selling into the space or a practitioner that wanted to use the technology. From there, I actually also spent time as a practitioner using technology and kind of managing environmental health and safety at a number of different firms: a utilities company, an automotive manufacturer, a chemicals company. And now I'm employed at Intelex, where, as you mentioned, I'm the strategic development manager, helping us accelerate our strategy. So my journey in EHS has brought me to ESG because the EHS profession is moving towards ESG, right? We're seeing this trend, we're seeing this boom of interest in ESG. Turns out that a lot of the data that people are actually asking for, a lot of the insights that people are worrying about when it comes to ESG, are already managed in a sense by the EHS department. And that's why the EHS department and the EHS world as a whole is so connected to this booming interest in ESG, because they're very closely related. And I think everyone is starting to realize that at this point.
Thank you, Trevor. And Michael, what about you?
Yeah, so my background's a little bit different. So I came in from technology. So my entire career was in financial technologies until this role. So I'd been through credit cards on the big data side, doing a lot of work with annuities and life insurance technologies. And so everything I've done is in the big data realm, and then moved into Intelex on the environmental side. So building out big oil and gas transactional databases with the company, and trying to figure out how we can do that through air emissions and water and waste installs and all environmental on this side. And then as ESG and really sustainability has become so focused from the forefront on operational ESG and how you get to those deep levels of data information, it really put together the skill sets that I have, in that I have that big data understanding. I know how we get there. I know how we get to insights from data. And then the work I've done with Intelex, quite honestly, I work with the most amazing team. the team around me is unbelievable. They're the most unbelievably intelligent people I know. And they've just done a fantastic job of teaching me. They know and have likely forgotten more than I'll ever know about this. But that's where you get to lean on a team who you know you can trust. And so that has been my experience so far. And that's kind of how I ended up right where I am.
Well, thank you. I want to bring this back to for our audience kind of more at the beginning to understand, why is ESG important? And then move from there about what influence will ESG have on businesses in the next 10 years, so 5 to 10 years. So let's start with the why. Why is it important?
Sure. Why not kick that off, Tamara? And then Trevor, feel free to dive in what you want to. Ultimately, it's important because finance says it's important right now. The financial markets are saying that ESG is the thing that we want to focus on because it's been seen as a risk proxy. And that's bringing to the fore all of the environmental information, health and safety information that HSE professionals already collect. They know full well what that information looks like. They know how to get environment, waste, water, air, health and safety, ARC Health, IH, all of these different pieces of information that they already deal with. And so when the CEO is told by the board, hey, we need to know this, we need to know your ESG numbers, where do you land on this? And specifically around carbon right now, the first question is, where do I even get that? And a lot of times that question comes down to the HSE department because that's where a lot of that information is. So that's the evolution of why we're taking it down to that level and why it's coming into the HSE group. ESG ultimately is evolving around a lot of different things. So we've seen Elon Musk and his comments around ESG. We've seen the comments from the world. And ultimately, I think as an HSE group, we should be looking at this as, hey, this is the importance of sustainability. This is the importance of solving the problems for our world. This is our operational ESG for an HSE team. It is not necessarily the finance or the financed emissions and things like that you look at from that perspective. It is really and truly that true operational data that comes to become ESG data. And especially right now, that is all focused on carbon, and everyone's asking about carbon, and that's where we really are. And fortunately for us, that is where we are incredibly strong. I don't know, Trevor, if you want to add to that and dive into the second part of the question.
No, I mean, I think you pretty much covered it. You're right. The level of interest, the emergence of this is a topic that's on everyone's mind. The reason, we're here having this conversation today is because the financial community specifically has taken a huge interest in that. And when there's, money at play, for better or worse, things happen, right? Things move, things shake. That itself, you could argue, is a result of an increasing level of awareness among kind of the general public, right? The world at large on climate change, its relevance to our actually daily lives. It's always been something that was talked about, right? It's not new, but the tangible effects, the material impacts that we see on a day-to-day basis are seemingly increasing. People are just more aware of climate, and that means that companies need to answer to that, because when people are more aware of climate, the financial community is more aware of it. People are asking for data. They need to produce data. And it's not only a risk proxy in terms of what are you doing? Do you have net zero goals? What's your carbon goals? But we're also seeing interest in what does climate change mean to the company itself? Do you have operations in areas which are going to be severely impacted by a shifting climate, whether that mean a rising sea level because you have coastal operations, or even you have operations in an area which will become less habitable over the years, meaning you may not be able to have a factory there. You may see mass migration. I mean, it's so incredibly broad, right? But that's the interest from the financial community is absolutely driving it. And to Mike's point, when you need to report, I mean, that's what the financial community wants to see at the end of the day, is a report card, more or less. What are you doing? What's the potential impact, and what are you doing to slow it? But he's dead on. That itself is the culmination of so much operational data. There's so much going on behind the scenes to get to that number, to produce that, and to action what you say you're going to do about climate change, what you're going to do about ESG, what you're going to do about sustainability. And that really comes from the EHS department, or at least a really big portion of it. And that's the big tie. So it's been one thing to talk about it, but now there's a necessity to walk the walk for a number of reasons. And walking the walk is something that the EHS department is very largely responsible for.
So I want to also drill down on the S&G portion of this. So far, when we're talking about the climate, et cetera, and carbon, am I correct that we're really focusing on the environmental piece?
Yes.
So let's unveil the social and the governance piece, because I think that is where people are a little bit mystified. Can you help understand why is that important, and how is that going to be influencing our businesses over the next 5 and 10 years?
Yeah, I can kick off your mic and you can follow up. You're right, Tamara. Lately, ESG, the focus has very much been on the E, and very much been on carbon and environmental sustainability. And I think that's the most well understood part of it, but that's only one letter of a 3-letter acronym, right? So there's the social and the governance element. The social element is broad. The social element can include things like people safety, worker safety, occupational health. This is something that Intelex has played in for 30 years now. But it also includes things like diversity and inclusion at a company, equitable pay practices, things like that. There's so much more, community relations, philanthropy, et cetera, things you're helping with make on a social level, whether they be your own employees, your community, or really the world at large. So one of the reasons I think it's been such a kind of such a hard thing for people to wrap their heads around is because there's a lot to wrap your head around, and there's not really one department or one solution that manages all of those things. Whereas maybe for carbon or EHS, there is, right? And on the governance side, governance is as old as business itself. I mean, this has been around for a long, long time. You look at the governance, risk and compliance, or GRC software market, which is a very, very mature market. This is because to run a company, you need some semblance of governance practices. This is following basically the compliance rules and making sure you're operating in a way that's above board. There's just more of a focus, I think, on this now as it's lumped in with ESG. They want to, the investors, the financial community want to make sure that they're protected from these non-financial risks. In a unethical way of operations or a way that's not in compliance is not always financially related, but can nonetheless have a very material impact on the financial results of your company. As well, you see things like the social element. You're seeing, you mentioned earlier when we kicked off this call, a problem with access to talent, the great resignation, as it's been known, which is more the great movement of people around to different jobs. But people are attracted to jobs which have a good mission, which treat their people well, which treat the community well, which are doing something for good. So positioning yourself and then not just talking the talk again, but walking the walk on being a good company from a social perspective is going to pay real dividends for your company. You'll get better people. You'll have people that stay longer. You'll have people that are more motivated to work. So it's all very broad, but we're going to see these impacts play out, especially as people really come to terms with the E part of it and feel like they have, carbon or climate kind of under control and have a plan. They'll move on to the other parts of ESG.
I think you nailed it, Trevor. I think the way I would look at it as ES and G, the S and G are kind of mystifying in some ways because we don't always pay attention to it. Mm-hmm. But like Trevor said, the G has solidly been how we've driven business for a long time. So it's tax transparency, it is board pay, it is all those things. Mm-hmm. And if you look at it, like S&P's numbers on ESG, which I think a lot of people talk about numbers, there's commercials now where they show someone holding a phone. It's like, what's my ESG score for my investment portfolio? Like those things are really cool. But when you look at someone like an S&P Global, who, most people know who they are, they do not allow the governance score to be less than 35% of the entire score as you aggregate it, whereas the other two can actually flex up and down. That is because managing a business within the realms of managing a business is never going to be not important. Mm-hmm. And so a lot of that is managed by the corporate pieces of a company. And it's already managed somewhere. It's already in its software. It's already in a tax system. And so as the EHS professional looks at it, I would call that kind of outside your realm in a lot of ways. It's something that we as a company, for instance, plan to integrate to and integrate data from, because that's the way we should get information to and from it. We have the ability to get data in and out, but we want to make sure that we're not taking on the things that we can't do. But that is your financial accounting for a company. I think as you look at environmental, which is your E, that's the second pillar of what this becomes and why there's been a lot around double materiality, right? Because you want to make sure you're financially sound and you're sound for the world, which is your environmental footprint. And so environmental, again, is incredibly manageable. You know how you're creating emissions, you know what they are, you know how you can solve them, you know how to change them, and they're fully under your control in a lot of ways. So governance and environmental are controllable assets or controllable pieces of your business. Social, less so. Social is the place that's controlled by geopolitical or social like social action in the world and the things that are really important at that time. And so as you look at the intersection of the two, that's where social drives culture. So if you think of your business controlled by two pillars, social is then the culture of your business. And so that's where that's going to become more and more important as we see the age group of business quite honestly drop in some ways. Like we're certainly seeing within technology, as people age out of business, expectations on technology systems are higher. People want something that they click and it works, that they have delivered just like their bank account. Or like if you can do a complex statement on your bank account, why can't you do something very similar for EH&S? And so you're starting to see the social push the company and quite honestly, the industry as a whole. But that's where I'd say social is really your culture. It's your culture within your company and something that is constantly changing and moving as the world changes and moves. Your environment and your governance are going to be solid. They're going to be, you measure them. They are measurable and attainable and changeable. So you have full control over it. And that's kind of the way I think about the three as you look at it.
Now, Michael, I did also want to ask you something that's maybe in the wheelhouse of finances, right? And I'm just going to be very upfront with you. I'm not really knowledgeable in this area, but I do understand that there's a proposed rule from the US SEC. Now, I think that SEC means Securities and Exchange Commission. Did I get that one right? Because I'm a health and safety professional, not a trader on Wall Street.
You did. It is the Securities and Exchange Commission. Yeah.
So maybe you can shed some light on what is that and why should we care about it? Because this came up in a research conversation for this discussion.
Yeah, good question. So ultimately, there's a couple rules that the SEC has put out. One of them is around the way that finances on investing is measured. And then the other one is around true operational emissions from your company. And so what they've asked for is the companies that have a revenue of over $1 billion a year, put any numbers of their scope 1 and scope 2 emissions, let's start there, on your 10K. So you're going to have to start measuring those as of January 1st, 23 is the basis around that. Now the comment period actually ended June 17th, so last week. And there's obviously that means we're not quite there yet. The dates aren't quite set. The actual framework isn't quite set. But ultimately what they want to see is all of your scope 1, so your direct emissions, and then your purchased emissions from things like electricity, gas, all those different things you purchase to make your locations work. They want to see the numbers on those, see that you're decreasing those and that you're hitting your plans to go to net zero if you have them. Then if you have included scope 3 on your plans, so you've said, hey, inclusive of scope 3, we want to see a decrease. Currently, what the rule says is you have to then report your scope 3 on the 10K as well. But now there's two ways to look at this. First thing I said, it's above $1 billion in revenue a year. It's not a lot of companies. But what that means is it's the biggest companies in the world that turn around to their supply chain and say, hey, I have to do this. Therefore, you have to provide me this information. Which is one of the things that a lot of people aren't seeing is mid-market or smaller enterprise are going to have to start to provide this information to their larger companies that they provide stuff to or provide goods and services to. So there is, as much as the SEC is asking for it from the larger companies, the high revenue companies, they are going to force the supply chain, and the issue it rolls downhill. So like, big companies have to do it, the little companies have to do it too, because they have to provide information to the big company. So that, I think for the HSE professional, that's the important thing. One of the first couple pages in there, it's 570 something pages, says $1 billion in revenue. Don't quit reading, keep reading, you have to do it.
Now that sounds like we could make a whole new podcast series for that. So I'm going to bring it back to where our audience's wheelhouse is, and that's environmental health and safety. And I wanted to kind of open up and talk about how is the influence of ESG going to be shaping the practice of EHS? Trevor, why don't you kick that off for us?
Yeah, sure. So it's shaping the practice of EHS in a number of ways. The biggest one is that because of the relationship between EHS and what constitutes ESG. So as we mentioned, there's many things that constitute ESG, but some of the most important ones are going to be air emissions. It's going to be worker safety. It's going to be waste management, things like that, water stress, even and water quality. These are all things that the EHS people deal with. So There is a new demand for data that is scrutinized, that is auditable, that is legitimate, like investor grade data, right? That's where this is coming from, that investors want this because they want more information on risks, as Mike alluded to earlier. So it's changing the job of EHS because they are going to need to get this data out to a new set of stakeholders and make sure this data is of the quality that this new set of stakeholders expect. It's not even so much that the job changes, but the visibility of the job will change, the importance of the job will change, and the scope of the job will increase as the tides of ESG shift from carbon to people safety, to worker well-being, to waste, to water. EHS professionals need to be cognizant of how those changes are going to impact them. So the big thing, I guess, would be the scope of the job changes more so than the job itself. There's the relationship because they are, I don't want to say synonymous, but they overlap. But EHS managers will be taking a more active role, a more visible role in the success, the reputation, if you will, of the company.
Mike, did you have anything you wanted to add to that?
I don't.
Oh, okay.
I think Trevor crushed it.
Okay, I think he did too, but that's okay because I've got questions for you. Now you do you're VP of ESG, right? And so do most companies have a director that is a director of sustainability or ESG? Because it's a new title that I've heard. So I'm kind of curious, like, have you seen a lot of other people doing that role?
Great question. We have. So we've seen that across business. We've certainly seen the role evolving over the last couple of years, even into like chief sustainability officers, C-level, and truly having someone that has say in the day-to-day running of a business that has an effort or had effort in the EHS, because I think that that's the real valuable thing, is seeing that the EHS role can really and truly step up all the way to the board level now. And a lot of that is just based on information that has always been important to the business. And one of the best ways I've heard it is it's taking H&S from critical but non-strategic to critically strategic. It's both, right? It becomes something that is incredibly important for the business to get your EHS right. Because if you don't have your emissions right, you're going to start to have troubles with the SEC in the US. You're going to have issues with investors. You're going to have issues with, quite honestly, social capital is really important at this point as well. One wrong move on Twitter and things fall down, right? And so having that social capital, social understanding of who you are as a business, what you're trying to do is incredibly important. And all of that data falls out of the EHS team. And so just bringing that to the forefront is, I think, how it changes. And quite honestly, it's where that role is coming from and why we're seeing the evolution of the role, because it's a difficult role for an EHS professional. It is new in a lot of ways. It is talking to different stakeholders like you haven't before. And so I think that that's the really important bit, is it's going to take people to step forwards and do it with confidence and know that you can trust your data. And a lot of times, I get asked all the time, who's your biggest competitor? Typically it's Microsoft Excel. Like that is who we compete with on a 99% of deals, because that is who people typically use for all of this information.
So I'm just trying to get my head around this. So then will the person who is now doing environmental health and safety, those professionals, get the ESG added on to what they're doing? Or is it more strategic to have an individual like yourself who is purely ESG, who will be then working collaboratively with the EHS team so that you've got more intelligence rather than trying to stress one person out?
Good question. So I think it depends on the company. I think that that's where what we've seen from our clients is different people do it differently, and understanding your company politics is the way that makes sense. So it's not dissimilar to rolling out a piece of software. Some companies, it's top down, you force it out there, you force it down on people. Other companies like to see that adoption from the ground level and say, hey, okay, we really like this. This is what we want to see the changes, and really see that from the practitioner and the people operating business. And so I think that this is not dissimilar. There is not a one size fits all for what role you should create in your business. It absolutely depends on what kind of business you're in, what vertical you're in, what kinds of things you're looking at. And even for me specifically, I do environmental compliance and ESG or sustainability. Like I have both sides of that within Intelex. So I build like the operational, which is why we talk operational ESG, because I do not control like the things we spend financial money on, like who are we investing in? Why are we investing in them? Are we looking at their carbon impact? Like that's really where a lot of the financial ESG component comes. And so Intelex is really focused on that operational piece of ESG. It's the emissions, it's the true raw actual data, not the financial exposure to different kinds of risks and how we assign risks and values to that.
Now, Trevor, did you have anything that kind of popped in your head before I move on to my next area that I was going to discuss?
Just I mean, what to I'll add my 2 cents in here. I've done this talk a number of times talking about this nexus between EHS and ESG, and I've heard from people after the webinars actually that have reached out to me and told me that, we sit here and we talk about the same things we've talked about today: the overlap, the responsibility shift, the visibility shift, et cetera. I've heard people that have had traditional EHS roles that have had sustainability or ESG added onto their title. I've heard people that have been, in a sense, promoted from an EHS job to a more overarching job where they have responsibility for an EHS professional and a sustainability professional. I've gone online and just looked to back this up with real evidence, and I've seen job descriptions of a director of sustainability where at the bottom it says reports into the VP of EHS, or jobs where it says you're the director of environment, health, and safety at this company, but in the requirements for the job, it says you're going to be responsible for setting and meeting our net zero goals and, managing things that fall under the purview of sustainability or the broader ESG sense. So we're just absolutely seeing the overlap here, the evolution of the role. Like I mentioned earlier, it's all about the scope expanding. Companies see that they want to manage this. They want to look for the most efficient way to manage it. And oftentimes that's through, or at least related to, the EHS department in some way. And to Mike's point, it totally depends on, from there, it kind of depends on how the company wants to do things.
Yeah, so I'm seeing that there's a lot of different applications here. So what I'm going to say to my audience and that's listening is we're going to put their contact information onto the episode page. So for sure, reach out to Trevor or Michael. They're great guys. You can also hit them up on LinkedIn and connect with them. And they are very open to helping answer any questions that you might have, because I know that from working with you over the years, you're both like that. Now, I wanted to kind of change gears a little bit here, because there's been a lot of stuff happening in the world over the last 3 or 4 years, actually, right? And so I'm wondering, how is this really impacting the adoption of ESG for some companies? We've had COVID that we've come through. We've had the great what are they calling it? I'm sorry, it went out of my head.
Great resignation.
Great resignation.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I wanted to say recession, but I knew that was the wrong word. So the great resignation that's happening. We've got the war in Ukraine. There's a lot going on. And even here at home, within our own area, we've got social unrest in certain areas. So there's a lot going on. What are your thoughts about that? Like, how is this going to impact, or is it even going to stall some companies from adopting ESG?
Yeah, it absolutely could. I mean, to Mike's point earlier about how the social pillar of ESG can kind of be a moving target, I think that's what we see represented. There are certain things at certain times the companies are expected to care about or contribute towards or talk about. So you always have to be aware of what's going on in the world to make sure you're lining up with the theme of the day or the issue of the day. Maybe the bigger thing for ESG broadly is that, to comply with these new rules or implement policies and programs, et cetera, that takes real money, right? So that can cut into your P&L. So there's a lot of talk of, at least in the US, but on a global scale too, entering a time of economic uncertainty, I guess we'll call it, to put it in the most nice diplomatic way I can. This means that companies are going to really think about where they spend, where they don't, what they can afford, what types of roles are important, what is really important to get through a time where you may not be making the money or growing at the rate you thought you would. So that's always a risk to something new in business. Now, I think because of the financial community's interest in ESG and the way this represents, in a sense, financial success, this is one lever to pull that may or probably will give it more sticking power when it comes to a time like this. But you can't ignore it, right? You need to be aware of what the broader global economy is doing, what it's saying, and how you adjust your operations. So ESG is not immune to that, but I do think it will be maybe more resilient than the sustainability theme was in the early 2010s or other things that have been dropped off.
I think that's a great place to start, Trevor. I think that as you look around, you see the Elon Musks of the world just not super happy with ESG, right? And so I think the most important thing for people to do is understand what it is and what it isn't, because as it pertains to business, the operational ESG piece of it is figuring out what your emissions are and doing better. It is sustainability, as was, and there's a lot of hard facts behind it. It is not the financial community piece. Financial community piece is then placed on top of that. The one caution I would place is I've seen a lot of conjecture around ESG is not going to exist. It's going to drop off like it did in 2008. It's going to go away. It's not. There's too many green bonds. There is too much money tied up in this. There's too much money that is based on reductions of emissions. And it is a huge problem for people that are not going to see the tree from the leaves. ESG is not just a fad in that it's not just the numbers. It's not just what S&P Global or those number producers create. It is the data behind that becomes important for your board pay, for things that are like, we have bonuses for board structures that are based on emissions and things like that. No board is going to say, hey, let's take that out because we don't want that bonus. Like, just be realistic about that and just understand the evolution of that and what's going to happen. And then even as you look at ESG from slightly different lenses of, hey, what does this even do for the world? Well, you can see the wildfires, the temperatures, wherever you are in the world. Like, there are blatant facts occurring. How often do you see, hey, it's the hottest it's been in X or since Y? Like, those are valuable pieces of information that we really need to take notes of. And remember that a lot of this is a socially based thing. That a lot of this is coming from people want to see change. They want to see companies do better. And it's going to be a struggle to get there. But we absolutely do have to get there. We have to get to a place where we're looking after the world for the future of our children, children's children, however you want to put it, whatever context you want to put it in. We want to make sure that we leave this place better than we found it. And so that is something that honestly is a call to action for all business. Let's leave it in a better place than we found it.
Yeah, I like what you're saying, leave it in a better place than we found it. And I don't think either of you have a crystal ball or anything, but I'm hoping that you might have some insights from your expertise in this area. Do you believe that the newer generations that are coming in are having a shift in this thinking of caring about what businesses do and holding them more accountable? Because they're pretty loud about it.
I think it's a great question. I think it's a question that is ultimately only answered by action and what we see happen. I would love to be able to say yes, like everyone that's young is doing this or X or Y or Z. There's still people that want to see, like, all that matters is the Benjamins in the green, right? Like, there's a real value to emissions, but there's also a whole group of people that don't believe in it. So it's not, I don't think it's a demographic thing where it's as easy as saying younger people say that this is the real deal. I think we have to prove that out. We have to make sure that everyone understands where we're at and why, and what the evolution can be of business into a place where it's material to have a positive environmental effect, not just a positive cash flow effect.
Yeah, I agree with Mike there. You could find a lot of data that says a new generation coming into the workforce really cares about that and is really passionate about this, amongst other causes, but that they really take a keen interest and factor this in when choosing a workplace or choosing a profession, et cetera. Now, that he's right, that data is one thing. When someone has a job offer sitting in front of them, that's another thing to see what choice they make. But everything would suggest that they probably will make a choice that is more, I don't want to say ESG focused because I don't want to box it in, but that their values will be real, and they will come out in the actions that they take. In fact, I just did a webinar yesterday talking about the trends in the energy and environment industry. So for all intents and purposes, the power generation, power distribution, oil and gas industries. And one stat that I had in there was that 85% of university students considering a career in the oil and gas industry say that it's important that their future employer has policies aimed at addressing climate change and environmental factors. So that's 85%. I mean, that's a big number. You can find a lot of stats just like that across industry, across purpose. But I do anticipate it to play a role.
I would add one thing to that, because Trevor's again right. I think there's a lot to take into account here. We have certainly seen the value of having ESG metrics and numbers within your business. We have clients that find it so we talked about employee churn. One of the actual metrics to keep people employed and keep people is actually how you're doing on your sustainability. So we have a lot of companies who have tried to communicate to their staff, hey, we just did this, which meant this. Mm-hmm. We just reduced waste, which means we did X number of less pounds, tons, whatever to landfill. And they're starting to find that when they tell their employees that, their employees can get on board with staying because they see the positive impact that their companies are having. And that's the data that like Trevor is talking about. It's not just theoretical university data or anything like that. We are truly seeing that, where our clients are saying, hey, look, we had people stay because of this. So we have this thing called Alliance within Intelex, and it was created for something completely different. Mm-hmm. But we found it to be really valuable for this because it's basically a bulletin in the system that tells you, hey, we did this. And that's what people are using it for and seeing a real positive impact on churn. And so just to that point, ESG does seem to have an effect, but I don't think we have enough data to say it's just the young people. It's everyone. I think it's affecting everyone, that the people want to see a positive impact from your company and from what you do day to day.
Well, I know for sure it matters to me that my company is doing good environmentally as well as socially and governance wise. So, hopefully the trend will continue, that we become more and more caring in this way. Now, we are at almost the end of our time. So before we go, I wanted to ask both of you, is there anything that you wanted to share with our audience before we end today?
I think we've really covered a lot of it today, Tamara. I mean, I want people to come away from this session understanding the relationship between EHS and ESG, the way that ESG and sustainability as a whole is going to change the EHS profession in the future. And I want people to understand that this is something that's here to stay and can have an impact. And I guess maybe the one single biggest takeaway that I want the EHS professionals listening to the call to have is that this presents a massive opportunity for you, for everyone in the profession. This is visibility, this is responsibility, this is a contribution to your firm's success, which is something that's always been a bit elusive to EHS folks, right? It's always been reducing unnecessary costs versus providing value. This is a way to provide value. So this trend, the emergence of this, is one of the biggest opportunities I think the industry has ever seen, and I hope that everyone recognizes and takes advantage of that.
I think from my perspective, I would just want people to know you're not alone. There are a ton of other people in similar businesses, similar situations to you with the same questions. Find your peer groups and ask them, because I think that the best way we can make companies better is by using our peers around us and people in similar positions and using business to drive business. Iron sharpens iron, right? Let's push it. Let's push it harder together, because the more people having impact on this, the better the output will be. Because at the end of the day, one company matters. 1,000 companies really matters. So push each other.
No, absolutely. Thank you so much, both of you, Michael and Trevor, for coming and having this discussion. You gave a wealth of insight and knowledge. So I'd like to say thank you again to our sponsor, Intelex Technologies, ULC. For those of you who don't know, Intelex Technology is a leader in the global environmental health and safety and quality management software, and offers a complete set of applications for EHSQ as well as for environmental, social, and governance. The company is headquartered in Toronto, Canada, and has regional offices and employees located around the world. Thank you again for joining us on our Safepedia podcast. And if you're looking for resources, join us at safepedia.com. Until next time, stay safe.